What if I told you that the Soviet Union didn't collapse because of Reagan's military spending, Chernobyl, or even economic stagnation? What if the real reason this nuclear superpower crumbled lay in a fundamental contradiction that existed from the very moment Lenin seized power in 1917? Picture this. It's December 25th, 1991, and Mikhail Gorbachev sits alone in his Kremlin office, the iconic red flag with its hammer and sickle being lowered from the building for the final time. The empire that once stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, commanding nearly 300 million people across 11 time zones, was about to vanish overnight. But the seeds of this collapse weren't planted in the 1980s during perestroika and glasnost. They were embedded in the very DNA of the Soviet system 74 years earlier. To understand why the USSR truly fell, we need to travel back to a snow-covered St. Petersburg in November 1917, where a small group of revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin stormed the Winter Palace. Lenin, a man of medium height with a distinctive goatee and piercing eyes, wore his characteristic dark wool coat as he proclaimed the birth of the world's first socialist state. The Bolsheviks promised a workers' paradise where the state would eventually wither away, leaving behind a classless, stateless society. But here's the fatal contradiction that would ultimately destroy them. To build this stateless utopia, they first needed to create the most powerful state apparatus in human history. Lenin understood that dismantling the old czarist system required unprecedented centralization of power. The Communist Party, initially numbering only about 24,000 members in a country of 140 million, would need to control every aspect of society to prevent counter-revolution and build socialism. They established the Cheka, a secret police force that would evolve into the KGB, and began implementing what they called democratic centralism, a system where all decisions flowed from the top down through rigid party hierarchies. The grand palaces of St. Petersburg, with their gilded halls and crystal chandeliers, became government offices where bureaucrats in gray suits would plan every detail of Soviet life, from factory production quotas to the number of shoes manufactured in Siberian cities. Joseph Stalin, Lenin's successor who rose to power through party machinations rather than popular support, took this centralization to its logical extreme. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with his trademark mustache and military-style jackets, Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state where the government controlled not just the economy, but every thought and expression of its citizens. Under his rule, the contradiction became starker. The party claimed to represent the workers while simultaneously oppressing them through forced collectivization, show trials, and mass deportations to gulags scattered across the frozen landscapes of Siberia and Kazakhstan. The Soviet economic system, built on 5-year plans managed by thousands of bureaucrats in Moscow's concrete government buildings, created another layer of contradiction. Central planners, sitting in offices adorned with portraits of Marx and Lenin, attempted to coordinate the production and distribution of millions of products across the world's largest country. They determined how many tractors would be built in Ukraine, how much grain would be harvested in Kazakhstan, and how many automobiles would roll off assembly lines in industrial cities like Gorky and Magnitogorsk. But without market prices to signal supply and demand, these planners were essentially flying blind, creating chronic shortages of consumer goods while overproducing unnecessary industrial equipment. By the 1960s, Soviet citizens waited in long lines outside state stores, their breath visible in the cold air as they queued for basic necessities like bread, meat, and clothing. The irony was unmistakable. The workers' state consistently failed to provide workers with the goods they needed, while party elites enjoyed access to special stores stocked with Western luxuries. This economic inefficiency wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature of the fundamental contradiction between centralized control and human nature's drive for individual initiative and reward. The arms race with the United States during the Cold War exposed another dimension of this core contradiction. The Soviet Union, despite its vast natural resources stretching from the oil fields of Baku to the gold mines of Siberia, was forced to allocate an unsustainable percentage of its gross domestic product to military spending. Some estimates suggest that by the 1980s, military expenditure consumed between 15 to 17% of Soviet GDP, compared to about 6% in the United States. The Kremlin's leaders, meeting in the imposing halls of the Senate building within the red brick walls of the Moscow Kremlin, faced an impossible choice: maintain military parity with a much wealthier adversary or allow living standards to continue declining. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in 1985, he inherited this system of contradictions. A relatively young leader at 54, with his distinctive port wine birthmark on his forehead, Gorbachev wore Western-style suits that symbolized his openness to reform. He understood that the Soviet Union could not continue as it was, launching his twin policies of glasnost and perestroika. But here's where the fundamental contradiction proved fatal. Any attempt to reform the system threatened the very foundations of Communist Party control. Glasnost allowed citizens to speak openly about the system's failures for the first time since the 1920s, while perestroika attempted to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy. The result was catastrophic for the party's legitimacy. Soviet citizens, watching television broadcasts from newly open media outlets, learned about the true extent of environmental disasters like Chernobyl, where reactor number 4 of the nuclear power plant had exploded in April 1986, sending radioactive clouds across Europe. They discovered the reality of their economic situation compared to the West, where supermarket shelves overflowed with choices while Soviet stores remained largely empty. The party that had justified its monopoly on power by promising to deliver prosperity and progress was exposed as having delivered neither. The independence movements that swept through the Soviet republics in the late 1980s represented the final manifestation of this core contradiction. The USSR had been created as a federation of ostensibly equal republics, but in reality, Moscow's centralized control had suppressed national identities and aspirations for decades. When Gorbachev's reforms weakened the party's grip on power, these suppressed nationalisms exploded into the open. From the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with their medieval old towns and Protestant churches, to the Islamic republics of Central Asia with their ancient cities along the Silk Road, peoples who had been forced into the Soviet system began demanding their freedom. The attempted coup in August 1991 proved to be the final act in this decades-long drama of contradictions. Hardline communists, led by figures like Vice President Gennady Yanev and Defense Minister Dmitry Azov, attempted to preserve the old system by placing Gorbachev under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea. But the coup failed not because of outside intervention, but because the system could no longer maintain the unity necessary for effective authoritarian control. Boris Yeltsin, standing atop a tank outside the Russian White House in Moscow, became the symbol of resistance to the coup, but the real victory belonged to the fundamental forces of decentralization that the Soviet system had tried to suppress for 7 decades. By December 1991, the constituent republics had declared independence one by one, leaving Gorbachev as president of a country that no longer existed. The red flag came down from the Kremlin on December 25th, replaced by the Russian tricolor, marking the end of an empire that had controlled nearly 1/6 of the world's land surface. The Soviet Union hadn't been defeated by external enemies or destroyed by a single catastrophic event. It had collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions. The real reason the Soviet Union collapsed was that it attempted something that may be impossible: building a modern, complex society through total centralized control, while simultaneously claiming to represent the interests of ordinary people. The party that promised to create a stateless society instead created the most intrusive state in human history. The system that pledged to deliver economic prosperity consistently failed to provide basic consumer goods. The ideology that claimed to unite all workers instead suppressed the national and individual aspirations that drive human progress. Today, as we watch various governments around the world struggle with questions of centralization versus individual freedom, economic planning versus market mechanisms, and globalization versus national sovereignty. The Soviet collapse offers crucial lessons. Modern China has attempted to resolve some of these contradictions by maintaining political centralization while allowing economic decentralization. But even this hybrid system faces growing tensions between state control and market forces. The European Union grapples with similar questions about how much sovereignty individual nations should surrender to supranational institutions. Even in established democracies, debates rage about the proper balance between government regulation and individual liberty, between collective welfare and personal responsibility. The collapse of the Soviet Union ultimately demonstrates that political and economic systems built on fundamental contradictions cannot survive indefinitely, no matter how powerful they appear at their peak. The men and women who lived through the USSR's final years didn't witness the defeat of an external enemy. They saw the inevitable resolution of contradictions that had been building pressure for nearly three-quarters of a century. The empire that once seemed permanent, with its massive military parades through Red Square and its nuclear arsenal capable of destroying the world several times over, crumbled not with a bang, but with the quiet resignation of a system that could no longer sustain its own internal tensions.